Levi, Thoughts on a Quiet Night. Beside my bed, the bright moon lit the floor. Waking, at first I thought it was the frost. I looked up to see the bright moon shining, then bowed my head to think of home again. So, we finished with Meng Haoran. We continue now with two poems also, this time by Li Bai. Li Bai, as you well know, is the second or first, I'm not completely sure. I think the second best represented poet in this anthology, and unquestionably the first or second poet in the whole of Chinese literature, or in at least the classical poetry. We've talked a lot about him in previous poems because, as we've just said, he has quite a lot of them here. Now, just as Menhauran's Spring Morning is a pretty famous poem of his, Li Bai's Thoughts on a Quiet Night is also a pretty famous poem of his as well. Not his most famous one, which would be one we've already read. I think it was a regulated pentasyllabic poem, the one in which he's dancing under the moon, drinking wine with his shadow. But, this is a very popular one. I'm 100% certain that I've read different versions of this poem in different books. In fact, I think I've read a book which commented on different versions of this poem, giving different translations. I've also read that in China this is included among the primary school curriculum. This is one of the first poems that modern Chinese students study and memorize at school. It makes sense because while it is a beautiful work of art, it is also, I think, as you have probably detected, it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't include any apparently obscure imagery. It's quite heavy on feeling, but it's a feeling that can be easily understood and interpreted. And it's pretty universal, even though some of the themes are the typical ones that we are used to from scholar official poetry of this period. So, what's the topic of the poem? Well, the title really epitomizes what the poem is about. What is the poet thinking in a quiet night? So, sub themes connected with this wakefulness at night. This is a very common trope that we've talked about a lot. The poet, the writer, wakes up at night and or is just incapable of going to sleep at night because of brooding thoughts, melancholy thoughts, generally about love or about frustration at politics and at not serving in office or at being far away from home. That's another element here that is very clearly introduced in the last line, homesickness. The poet is far away from home and is homesick. Another element, another sub-theme, it's a small poem, but you could say almost each line has a significant theme. The moon, the beauty of the moon. The moon is a very important character, at least conventionally so in Li Bai's poetry. You will remember the legend of his death, in which he drowned while he was allegedly jumping from a boat trying to grasp the image of the moon over the water. And a lot of his poems, including the one we just mentioned before, the one in which he was drinking wine with the moon and his shadow as only companions, also, places the moon in a high position. Very typical or very conventional of some of Li Bai's poems, which are taken as very representative of his, to have this close relationship with the moon, this almost friend-like, intimate, close relation with the moon as if it were an old friend. So the moon, its beauty. And there's also an element of elegant confusion, which I think we've talked about before. Here, the elegant confusion is the mistaking of moonlight for frost. And these sort of elegant confusions were very typical of the Six Dynasties poetry, I believe. And they would be later imitated by classical Japanese poetry as well. Although there, the most conventional topic, as far as I remember, is the poet's confusion of late winter, early spring, plum blossoms, and snow. So, let's go to the poem little by little. You could say perhaps there's also an element of the retired life, because from what the poet is describing, he seems to be sleeping in some sort of hut. It's not explicitly described as such, but one gets the impression that the poet is in some small hut or so, with the bed very close to the small window. So let's go as usual, couplet by couplet. First couplet. Beside my bed, the bright moon lit the floor. Waking, at first, I thought it was the frost. So the image is pretty transparent and pretty clear. The poet was in his bed sleeping. This is at night, we don't know where. The poet woke up and he saw a pool of shiny white at his feet, yeah, next to his bed. And whether he's just being poetically rhetorical or whether he genuinely felt so, when seeing that light, that moonlight coalescing, pooling next to his bed, entering through the window, he probably for a few seconds, got the impression that he was looking at frost, shiny white frost instead of moonlight. Now, it is conventionally said that moonlight is especially perceptible and brilliant during very dark nights, and especially in autumn. So that might contribute to an autumn setting for this poem. As we say, the confusion might be, just a literary convention. It might be moderately real, at least for the first few seconds of waking up of Li Bai's. He might have imagined if he was living in a small hut, he might have imagined that the roof might have broken during the night, and maybe water or frost might have fallen in. But anyway, we get this shiny moonlight crystallized on the floor, and this contrast between the verticality of the moon high up and the horizontality and the lower range of frost-like moonlight that is floating next to the bed of Li Bai. So the first couplet really presents us the scenario, what is happening. It hasn't really told us about any thoughts of Li Bai, except if we take this confusion of moonlight and frost to be a thought. The second line, or rather the second couplet, becomes a little bit more personal. And also it has two dynamic images, one of raising in the third line and one of lowering in the fourth line, which establish the two axes, the two elements which really stick their anchors or their thorns into the poet's heart, the moon and his home. I looked up to see the bright moon shining, then bowed my head to think of home again. So the poet, woken up, fascinated, intrigued, delighted by the beautiful tracery of frost-like moonlight at the foot of his bed, by this almost oniric supernatural sight, gazes up, maybe he's still in his bed or he might have gotten up, but he gazes up to the source of this beautiful light, out through the window that must be in his hut or residence, and he looks at the moon shining, a sight that we know from other poems and from the conventions of Chinese scholar officials that would have delighted him. The moon does not just delight because of its beauty. Looking at the moon is also associated, and we've seen some poems about this, with longingness for home, as the last line will hammer in. It is conventional to paint lovers or friends looking at the moon and thinking of friends far away. And the connection is that this same beautiful moon that is being gazed at by me is the same beautiful moon that another sleepless friend or beloved person of mine is looking at and thinking about me. So we are both united by this common act of gazing at the moon that shines for both of us. So appreciating the beauty of the moon, the poet also connects with this idea of longing for the ones at home. Instead of raising, now his head is sinking with sadness, with melancholy, and he bows his head thinking of home again. And remember, Li Bai is not your stereotypical scholar official. He hardly dabbled in any official position at all. But still, he shares the values of the scholar official class and of most Chinese of his time, of strong rootedness into one's land, into one's original place, where one's family, where one's home, and where one's family's graves and ancestors dwell. So there is this sadness of parting and this sadness of being far away, which the poet laments. And the poem ends thinking of home again, probably not for the last time.